It is one of the most notorious assassinations in modern history. The murder of the Romanovs, Russia's ruling family. Once the subject of a high-stakes murder investigation, the trail went cold over 50 years of Soviet rule. Now, the mysterious deaths are fueling a heated battle between forensic scientists, religious leaders, and Russia's political elite.
In 1918, 11 people walked into a basement in Yekaterinburg, and none of them walked out. For decades, the world was told a lie so complete, so deliberate, that it shaped generations of history. Bodies were burned, evidence erased, and questions silenced. But one force could not be controlled: the truth. In 2007, DNA pulled from the Russian soil shattered the cover-up, revealing a secret the most powerful government in the world tried to bury forever. This is not just a murder. This is the story of the Romanovs, a dynasty that ruled Russia for over 300 years, and the night that became one of the darkest, most mysterious moments of the 20th century. And the question remains: what happens when history itself becomes a weapon? The fall of an empire. To understand why the Romanovs had to die, you need to understand what they represented. For more than 3 centuries, this single family held absolute power over the largest nation on earth. They commanded armies, controlled the church, and ruled over a population of nearly 200 million people.
The Tsar was considered the anointed of God. He controlled the government. He was the supreme head of the Orthodox Church. He was worshipped as a demigod by most of his subjects.
The Tsar was not merely a king. He was considered God's representative on earth, answerable to no parliament, no constitution, no one. That kind of power does not end quietly. It ends in blood. By 1917, Russia was breaking apart. World War I had decimated the army and starved the cities. Soldiers were deserting by the thousands. Workers were striking. The peasants, who had suffered under feudal conditions for generations, were done waiting for reform. And at the center of it all sat Tsar Nicholas II, a man who genuinely believed that God had chosen him to rule and that his people would remain loyal no matter what. He was wrong. In February 1917, protests erupted in the capital. Within days, the army had turned against the throne. Nicholas abdicated, ending 300 years of Romanov rule in a single signature.
Early 1917, the Russian Empire was in chaos. The Tsar's political opponents launched a revolution in Petrograd, and the 300-year Romanov dynasty came to an end.
He believed he was saving Russia from civil war. Instead, he was signing his family's death warrant. The provisional government that replaced Nicholas initially treated the former imperial family with surprising gentleness. They were placed under house arrest in the Alexander Palace, guarded but comfortable. The plan was to send them into exile, perhaps to England, where Nicholas had royal cousins. But the British government quietly refused to accept them, fearing political backlash at home. The Romanovs were trapped in a country that no longer wanted them, surrounded by forces that increasingly saw them as a threat rather than an inconvenience. In October 1917, everything changed again. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution far more radical than the first. These were not reformers looking to modernize Russia. They were revolutionaries who believed the entire old order needed to be destroyed root and branch. And nothing symbolized that old order more completely than the Romanov family. As civil war erupted across Russia, with anti-Bolshevik forces fighting to restore some version of the old regime, the former Tsar became more than an inconvenience. He became a rallying point, a symbol that enemies of the revolution could use to unite opposition. The Bolsheviks moved the family deeper into Russia, first to Tobolsk in Siberia, then to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains.
For 78 days, the family has lived in a drab compound in the remote city of Yekaterinburg.
Each move took them further from potential rescue and closer to their fate. The House of Special Purpose. In April 1918, a convoy carrying the former rulers of Russia arrived at a two-story merchant's house in the industrial city of Yekaterinburg. The building had belonged to a military engineer named Nikolai Ipatiev, a man of modest wealth who had no idea his home would become infamous. The Bolsheviks had requisitioned the property weeks earlier, evicting the owner and erecting a tall wooden fence around the perimeter. They painted the windows white from the inside so no one could see in or out. Guards took positions at every corner, and among themselves, the men who controlled this place called it by a name that left no doubt about its purpose. They called it the House of Special Purpose.
A house owned by the merchant Ipatiev, referred to as the House of Special Purpose by the Bolshevik leaders.
The Romanovs did not know what that purpose was, but everyone else involved understood exactly what it meant. The family that entered the Ipatiev house bore little resemblance to the imperial dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. Nicholas, once the most powerful autocrat in Europe, now walked with the uncertain gait of a man who had lost everything and knew more losses were coming. Alexandra, the Tsarina who had commanded palaces and influenced policy, was a shell of her former self, worn down by years of anxiety over her son's illness and the collapse of everything she believed in. They arrived not as royalty but as prisoners, stripped of titles, servants, and any illusion that their status might protect them. The world they had known was gone. This house would be their entire world now. The children adapted as best they could to confinement that grew more suffocating by the day. There were 4 daughters.
Their 4 daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia.
Olga, the eldest at 22, had been old enough to serve as a nurse during the war and carried herself with a quiet dignity that her captors found unsettling. Tatiana, 21, had inherited her mother's bearing and tried to maintain order in increasingly chaotic circumstances. Maria, 19, possessed a warmth that sometimes softened even the guards who watched her. And Anastasia, 17, clung to humor as her defense against despair, cracking jokes and staging small rebellions that briefly lifted the gloom. Then there was Alexei, the 13-year-old heir to a throne that no longer existed. He was the reason for so much of the family's suffering, though he had never asked for any of it. Alexei had been born with hemophilia.
The impact of hemophilia on the family with regard to Alexei the Tsarevich of Russia.
A genetic disorder that prevented his blood from clotting properly. A simple bruise could cause internal bleeding that lasted for days. A minor fall could be fatal. His condition had been the most closely guarded secret of the imperial court, known only to family and a handful of trusted advisors. It was this illness that had driven Alexandra into the arms of Rasputin, the mysterious mystic who seemed able to calm the boy's bleeding episodes when doctors failed. And it was Rasputin's influence that had helped turn public opinion against the royal family in the years before the revolution. Now, in captivity, Alexei grew weaker by the week. He could barely walk. His mother watched helplessly, praying for miracles that would never arrive, while the guards outside counted down the days until their special purpose would be fulfilled. Life inside the house followed a grim routine. The family was allowed to walk in a small garden for brief periods, always under armed guard. They ate simple meals, a far cry from the elaborate banquets of their former life. They read, they prayed, they tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in conditions designed to strip away their humanity. The guards were under orders to treat the prisoners with deliberate disrespect, addressing Nicholas as Nicholas Romanov, rather than any title, reminding him constantly that he was no longer anyone special. Some guards followed these orders with cruel enthusiasm. Others found themselves moved by the family's quiet dignity and began to treat them with small kindnesses that could have cost them their positions, or worse. Outside the whitewashed windows, the Civil War was turning. White Army forces, a coalition of anti-Bolshevik groups, were advancing toward Yekaterinburg. If they reached the city, they might attempt to rescue the Romanovs and use them as a rallying symbol for the counter-revolution. A living czar, even a deposed one, could unite opposition forces in ways that a dead one never could. The Bolshevik leadership understood this calculation with cold clarity. Lenin and his commanders faced a choice that was really no choice at all. They could attempt to move the family deeper into Soviet territory, risking escape during transport. Or they could ensure that no rescue would ever matter, that the symbol would be destroyed before the enemy arrived to claim it. The exact chain of command for what came next remains debated by historians. Some evidence suggests Lenin personally authorized the execution. Other accounts point to local commanders making the decision and receiving approval afterward. What is beyond dispute is that by mid-July 1918, the men guarding the Ipatiev house had received their orders. The special purpose of this place was about to be revealed. The Romanovs continued their prayers and their reading, their small walks in the garden, their attempts to believe that exile might still be possible. They did not know that a basement room was being prepared, that a firing squad was being assembled, that their final night had almost arrived. The House of Special Purpose was ready to fulfill its name. 78 minutes of horror. Shortly after midnight on July 17, 1918, the Romanov family was awakened and told they needed to move to a safer location.
The guards wake the royal family, telling them that they are being moved to a safe location.
Anti-Bolshevik forces were approaching, they were informed, and the family needed to wait in the basement while transportation was arranged. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was too weak to walk. Alexandra asked for chairs. The family and their 4 remaining servants, a doctor, a cook, a valet, and a maid, assembled in a small basement room.
The family doctor and 3 servants. Yurovsky arranges his prisoners in a row.
They had no idea they were standing in their execution chamber. The commander of the execution squad was Yakov Yurovsky, a loyal Bolshevik who had been planning this night for days. He entered the room with a group of armed men and read a brief statement declaring that the Romanovs had been sentenced to death by the Ural Soviet. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What?" before the shooting began.
He said, "What? You know, what did you say?" And Yurovsky pulled out his gun and shot Nicholas point blank.
The small basement room became a chaos of gunfire, smoke, and screaming. The noise was deafening. Bullets ricocheted off the walls. Some of the daughters did not die immediately because they had sewn diamonds and jewels into their corsets, hoping to smuggle them into exile. The gems acted as makeshift armor, deflecting bullets. The guards resorted to bayonets and rifle butts to finish what the gunfire had started. The entire massacre took approximately 20 minutes, though some accounts suggest certain victims remained alive and suffering for much longer. When it was finally over, 11 bodies lay on the basement floor. The Romanovs: Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. Their servants: the doctor, the cook, the valet, and the maid. Yurovsky and his men now faced a different problem. What do you do with the bodies of a former emperor and his family when the entire world is watching? The answer they chose would create a mystery that lasted nearly a century. The burial and the lie. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven into the Koptyaki forest outside Yekaterinburg. Yurovsky's original plan was to dump them down a mine shaft, but when that proved impractical, the executioners improvised. They dug a shallow grave in a muddy road, stripped the bodies, and attempted to burn them with gasoline. The burning was only partially successful. They then poured sulfuric acid on the remains to make identification more difficult, covered the grave with soil and railroad ties, and drove trucks over the site to disguise the disturbance. But Yurovsky made a deliberate choice that would haunt investigators for decades. He separated 2 of the bodies, Alexei and one of his sisters, and buried them in a different location about 70 meters away. He never fully explained why, but the effect was clear. Even if someone found the main grave, 2 children would still be missing. The uncertainty was built into the cover-up from the beginning. The Soviet government's official story evolved over time, but never approached the truth. Initially, they announced only that Nicholas had been executed, claiming the family had been moved to safety. Later, they acknowledged that the entire family had died, but provided no details about how or where. The location of the bodies remained a state secret, known only to a handful of officials who had every incentive to stay silent. For 70 years, the Soviet Union maintained this lie. And in the absence of proof, imagination filled the void. Throughout the 20th century, dozens of people came forward claiming to be surviving Romanovs. The most famous was Anna Anderson, a woman who appeared in Berlin in 1920 and spent the rest of her life insisting she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia. She knew details about the imperial court that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. She had scars that could have come from bullet wounds. She convinced many people, including some Romanov relatives, that she was genuine. Courts in Europe spent decades trying to determine her identity. She became a celebrity, the subject of books and films, a symbol of hope that someone had escaped that basement. She was not Anastasia. We know this now because of DNA. But for most of the 20th century, her story and others like it kept the mystery alive. The Soviet government never provided the evidence that would have ended the speculation because that evidence was buried in a forest, and they intended it to stay there forever. The graves give up their secrets. The Soviet Union began to crack in the late 1980s. Censorship loosened, archives opened, and people who had kept secrets for decades began to talk. In 1979, a geologist named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker named Gely Ryabov had actually located the main Romanov grave using old documents and local knowledge. They even exhumed some remains to confirm what they had found. But the Soviet state still existed, and they understood the danger of revealing their discovery. They reburied what they had found and waited. They waited for 10 years, until the Soviet system was collapsing and it was finally safe to speak. In 1991, the grave was officially exhumed under the supervision of Russian authorities. What they found confirmed the historical accounts. 9 skeletons lay in a shallow pit, their bones damaged by acid and time, but still intact enough for analysis. The question now was whether science could prove what history suggested. Could these bones be definitively identified as the Romanovs? The answer would require a technology that did not exist when the murders were committed: DNA analysis. Scientists extracted genetic material from the skeletal remains and began a painstaking process of comparison. They used 2 primary methods. The first was mitochondrial DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineage. Mitochondrial DNA passes unchanged from mother to child, creating a genetic signature that can be tracked across generations. The scientists compared the mitochondrial DNA from the female remains to samples from living relatives of the Tsarina Alexandra, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who shared a maternal ancestor with the Russian Empress. The match was conclusive. The second method involved nuclear DNA and short tandem repeat analysis, which could establish family relationships between the remains themselves. The results showed exactly what historians expected: 2 adult parents and 3 female children, along with 4 unrelated individuals consistent with the known servants. But there was a problem. The grave contained only 9 bodies. Historical accounts said 11 people died in that basement. 2 children were missing: the Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. The Soviet cover-up had worked exactly as intended. Even after the main grave was found and identified, doubt remained.
Where were the other 2?
The missing and the Choas. For 16 years after the 1991 exhumation, 2 ghosts haunted the Romanov case. The main grave had yielded 9 bodies. History said 11 people died in that basement. Somewhere in the Russian forest, the Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters remained lost, and that absence kept doubt alive. Conspiracy theorists pointed to the missing children as proof that the official story was incomplete. Maybe someone had escaped. Maybe the executioners had shown mercy to the youngest victims. Maybe the Soviet cover-up ran even deeper than anyone knew. The missing bodies were not just a forensic problem. They were an open wound that refused to heal. Yurovsky's own notes indicated that he had buried Alexei and one daughter separately, about 70 meters from the main grave. But his directions were vague. The forest had changed over decades, and multiple search teams found nothing. Some historians began to wonder if the separate burial was itself a fabrication, another layer of deception in a case built entirely on lies. Then, in the summer of 2007, a group of amateur archaeologists scanning the area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar discovered bone fragments in soil that showed unmistakable signs of deliberate burning. The remains were badly damaged, charred and broken, subjected to the same brutal treatment as the other bodies. But enough genetic material had survived for modern science to work its methods. Scientists applied 3 different DNA analysis techniques to these fragments. Mitochondrial DNA traced the maternal lineage and matched the profile already established for Tsarina Alexandra. Y chromosome analysis examined the paternal line and connected directly to Tsar Nicholas II. Autosomal testing confirmed family relationships between these remains and those already identified in the main grave. The results left no room for interpretation. The bones belonged to a teenage boy and a young woman, both genetically linked to the imperial family. Alexei and one of his sisters had been found. Every member of the Romanov family was now accounted for. The century-long mystery of the missing children was solved. You might think that DNA evidence would settle everything. It did not. The identification of the final remains opened battles that continue to this day. Battles fought not in laboratories, but in cathedrals, government offices, and the court of public opinion. In 1998, the Russian government had organized a state funeral for the remains from the main grave. President Boris Yeltsin attended as Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, and the 4 servants were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg.
The remains of Russia's last Tsar, his wife, and 3 of their 5 children have finally returned for burial in St. Petersburg,
the traditional resting place of Russian emperors. It should have been a moment of national closure. Instead, it became a moment of division that foreshadowed conflicts to come. The Russian Orthodox Church refused to fully participate in the 1998 burial. Church leaders expressed doubts about the DNA identification and demanded additional testing before recognizing the remains as authentic. This was not merely scientific caution. The Church had canonized the Romanovs as passion bearers in 2000, declaring them saints who met their deaths with Christian dignity. If the remains were genuine, they were not just bones but holy relics with profound spiritual significance. The stakes were too high for the Church to accept the government's word alone, and the standoff between religious authority and scientific consensus dragged on for years. The remains of Alexei and his sister, discovered in 2007, faced even longer delays. Despite DNA evidence that satisfied virtually every geneticist who examined it, the Church continued demanding additional verification. Bureaucratic negotiations between government ministries, religious authorities, and surviving Romanov descendants stretched across multiple presidential administrations. The children who had died together in that basement in 1918 remained separated from their parents in death for decades longer than anyone anticipated. The scientific case was closed, but the cultural and spiritual battles over what that science meant showed no sign of ending. These disputes reveal something essential about how history actually works. Scientific evidence can establish facts, but facts alone do not create meaning. The Romanov remains are not merely biological specimens to be cataloged and archived. They are symbols of Russian identity, of revolutionary violence, of the relationship between church and state, of how a nation chooses to remember the darkest chapters of its past. Different groups brought different stakes to the table. The government wanted closure and reconciliation. The church wanted spiritual certainty on its own terms. Historians wanted accuracy. Scientists wanted their methods respected. Surviving Romanov relatives wanted recognition and perhaps some restoration of symbolic status. All of these interests collided over a collection of bones, and in that collision we see that solving a mystery is not the same as resolving it. The DNA spoke clearly, but the argument over what those words mean continues and may never truly end. A century ago, 11 lives were extinguished in a basement. and the world was left to wonder what truly happened. Governments buried the truth, and history seemed locked away, yet the past has a way of speaking when we least expect it. The DNA proved that no secret, no matter how deeply hidden, can remain lost forever. Bones whispered across decades, surviving fire, acid, and regime changes, until science finally learned to listen. And yet, for every mystery uncovered, more shadows remain. How many other stories have been silenced by power, waiting for time, technology, or human curiosity to unearth them? What other truths are lying beneath the surface, patiently waiting for us to confront them? The Romanovs' graves gave up their secrets, but their story is not just about the past. It is a mirror for our present, a warning about what happens when truth is suppressed, and a challenge to anyone who seeks to understand the forces that shape history. The past is far from finished with us, and the questions it leaves behind are more urgent than ever. When history finally speaks, will we be ready to listen and to act on what it reveals?